What's up, everybody? It's me, E-Man, from E-Man's Movie Reviews, and today I'm going to break down Thor Love and Thunder. So if you're here, that means that you don't care about spoilers and you've probably seen the movie. Now, if you do care about spoilers and you haven't seen the movie, then please go check out my spoiler-free review on my channel and come right back to this video. Alright, you've been warned, so let's begin. We open up with Gorr traveling in what looks to be a deserted land with his daughter in his arms. He prays to the gods for water and food for his child. With no answers from high above, his daughter eventually dies. Preparing to die himself after burying his daughter, Gorr starts to hear whispers that awaken him. The voices start to lure him deeper into this paradise. Gorr stumbles and finds a huge wound on his hand. The wound, however, quickly begins to heal up. In this paradise, he meets the actual god that he's been praying to all this time. The god is celebrating the death of a previous holder of the Necro Sword. He takes notice of Gorr eating his fruit and mocks him for his worship. Before Gorr blacks out, he hears the same whispers again, which appear to be coming from the Necro Sword. They're now telling him that if he wants revenge, he has to kill all the gods, and he must summon eternity. Gorr listens to the whispers, and he kills the god before him. Well, this is when we actually get Gore's introduction, and I have to say that I wasn't entirely impressed. Now, one thing is very clear, and that is that Gorr has been suffering, and his people have been suffering, and the gods have turned their back on him. I mean, this was pretty much a perfect case of never meet your heroes. I think we would have benefited a little bit more by seeing more of Gorr's people and more of the suffering that they actually went through. And I'm not saying we need another full 10-15 minutes of this, but some actual visual effects would have been helpful. Actually seeing them similar to, let's say, how Thanos showed us how Titan was once very prosperous and then quickly turned to ruin. That would have been effective. In my opinion, the editing here was a little bit rushed, even though I do think that we got the general idea. Gorr was grieving, the gods didn't care, and now Gorr is out for revenge. Now, even if that wasn't the biggest deal, my bigger problem is actually the removal of agency from Gorr himself. As we saw, Gorr basically was possessed by the sword. The wound on his hand seemed to be whatever that substance was from the sword. Those whispers that he was hearing, clearly from the sword. I mean, this sword is clearly a big deal because the god didn't even bother acknowledging the being that was holding the sword before. He was just more focused on the sword and happy that no other gods were going to die by it. Now, I'll talk about the background for the sword a little bit later, but I wanted to point out how from this exact moment in time, Gorr's thoughts and actions are no longer really his own. Yes, he was suffering and grieving after the loss of his family, but the moment he saw that paradise, the sword was manipulating everything from that point on. The thought to even kill all gods or to summon eternity are not from Gorr at all. In other words, Gorr is basically a pawn with no original villainous ideas. There's no difference between him and that random, lifeless corpse that was holding the sword before him. This, of course, also suggests that there's a bigger bad guy working in the background, but we'll get to that later as well. For now, it's really disappointing that Gorr couldn't have been driven by his own motivations. Let's think back to villains like Thanos, Killmonger, or Baron Zemo. Neither of them needed to be possessed in order to have their motivations be unique onto themselves. The MCU likes to use the code word of being corrupted, but I think it's much more realistic to say that it's a mild case of possession. Same thing happened with the Scarlet Witch and the Darkhold. Popular theory is that the maker of the evil book, Chthon, was the real reason why Wanda was acting so nuts and why her plan never made sense in the first place. Anyway, I think had this movie taken just a little bit more time to give Gorr's backstory some more development, it would have solidified him more as a relatable, big-time villain that he had all the potential to be. There's another reason as to why Gorr is less significant, but we'll get to that later too. We find Korg recounting the story of Thor's life to alien children. He speaks of Thor's losses and depression and teaming up with the Guardians of the Galaxy. After working out to get rid of his dad bod, Thor gave up on his search for love, and he just waited for the call of anyone in need of his services in battle. While asked by the alien king for help, Thor easily defeats the enemy while also destroying the king's temple. As a parting gift, the king gives Thor 2 screaming space goats. The Guardians of the Galaxy receive several distress calls about a god butcher that is killing the gods. Thor notices that Lady Sif is also in danger and seeks to go help her. Before he leaves, Peter Quill has a heart-to-heart with Thor and talks to him about feeling crappy when you lose someone that you love. The Guardians take off and Thor sets out on his own path to help Lady Sif. He finds her with her arm missing, and she informs him that New Asgard is now Gorr's next target. Alright, so we're getting reintroduced to Thor going on to his journey of self-discovery. Now, I think this is important to understand why he's on this journey in the first place. Much of it has to do with the fact that he's never had a sense of identity that was his own. When we first met Thor in the first movie, he was cocky and arrogant. His ambitions were to eventually become king after his father Odin. Why? Because that's what everyone around him told him he was supposed to be. However, Odin didn't want Thor just to be king. He also wanted him to be worthy, hence why he cursed Mjolnir. By the time we get to Thor's second movie, he realized that being worthy isn't enough and that he would prefer to be a good man. When Thor Ragnarok came around, Thor realized that he was not the god of hammers, but the actual god of thunder. In other words, he had put too much faith in his hammer rather than in himself as a god. Then he was pushed into becoming the king of Asgard with Odin's death. After losing friends, family, and half his kingdom to Thanos in Infinity War, and being in a state of depression in Endgame, Thor realized that being a king just isn't for him. Hence why we now have Valkyrie as the new king of New Asgard. And all of that is what brings us to his current state of Thor, where he's trying to find himself and his purpose in life. Whether he achieves that by the end of this movie is still up for debate. Something else really important in this scene is the words of encouragement given to Thor by Star-Lord. As you may recall, Peter Quill was in a romantic relationship with Gamora until she lost her life to Thanos in Infinity War. While some time travel shenanigans did bring her back, she wasn't the same version of Gamora that fell in love with Quill. So Star-Lord is telling Thor that it's better to have loved and lost than to never have loved at all. Hence the whole "you gotta feel crappy about someone" line. Real quick, let me just say that it was a little disappointing that this was pretty much the only thing that made the Guardians of the Galaxy even remotely important here. And honestly, even that's a stretch. Anyone could have given Thor that piece of advice. I know that Thor was traveling with the Guardians of the Galaxy after Endgame, but they could have just kicked him out of the spaceship and kept him moving as a joke. But whatever, no big deal. Just saying. Jane Foster has been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and begins her chemotherapy treatments. She tries to find a way to combat the cancer until it dawns on her to try Asgardian methods. After reading a book about Mjolnir, she heads out for New Asgard. She can sense the broken hammer calling out to her, and the remnants start to activate. Some time passes and we find Gorr attacking New Asgard with shadow creatures. Thor arrives and begins to fight them all off. He sees Mjolnir flying around and is surprised to discover that the person wielding it was Jane Foster. Real quick, I just want to say that I absolutely love Jane's use of the hammer here. Although they did pretty much copy Captain America's Endgame hammer catch, but the way she was throwing that hammer around has to be the best we've seen it to date. Having the fragments separate and join back together was definitely a thing of beauty. Now, we go back to the story and Korg is given the backstory for Jane and Thor's love story. During the flashbacks, Thor made Mjolnir promise he was always going to protect Jane. Then an inscription appeared on the hammer. As time progressed, both Jane and Thor became afraid of a future with one another. As a result, they became more distant with each other. This prompted Jane to write a letter to Thor, which he took as their breakup. In this moment, I think we see why it is that Mjolnir and Jane are now connected. It was Thor's request to have the hammer protect Jane that bonded it to her. I want you to notice that we're starting to see an actual progression in Thor's character. He's becoming more like Odin at this point. He now has the ability, even though he didn't realize it, to enchant his hammer the same way Odin enchanted the hammer before. If we are getting technical about it, I don't think this superseded the other spell that was originally on the hammer, but instead it just added another enchantment on top of it. So not only will the hammer protect Jane, but she is also worthy to have Thor's power. I do have one issue with this enchantment that might be a little bit of a plot hole, but I'll get to that a little later in the video. So in case anyone missed it, this breakup is part of what makes their love story so intriguing. The interesting part is that I noticed that Thor started contemplating a future with Jane, which included starting a family. However, he was afraid of losing her. Their dating happened between Thor Ragnarok and Thor Dark World. So just recall that during that time frame, Thor had lost his brother Loki twice, and he just lost his mother Frigga. So being so close to another loved one and losing them could be a legit fear for him. At the same time, Jane was fearing that loss probably for other reasons. Thor is a warrior after all, and he's constantly going into battle and putting his life on the line. There's a possibility he might not ever come back. Either way, they both could have issues with long-term commitment, and as a result, they created obstacles in their own lives to overtake their relationship. Jane got busy with her research, and Thor would go run off to save the world. Ultimately, when you don't take time to invest into your relationship, you're going to start drifting apart. Now, this notion of losing a loved one is going to play into the overall theme of love later on in the movie. As the attack on New Asgard continues, Thor takes on Gorr head on. Before Gorr could be defeated, he slithered back into the shadows, but not before he kidnapped all the Asgardian children. While still in a panic, a town meeting is held. Thor tries to call Mjolnir, but Stormbreaker shows up instead. While Thor attempts to give a motivational speak, he's distracted by Meeks taking minutes on the board. Thor leaves to find the missing children, but Stormbreaker was unable to focus the Bifrost abilities. Thor explains that the Necro Sword is an ancient weapon passed down since the dawn of time. It has the ability to kill gods, but it also corrupts and kills the person wielding it. Just then, Heimdall's son, Astrid, or now Axel, uses his ability to contact Thor. Thor teaches him to use his eye powers to connect Thor as a vision ghost. Thor realizes that the children are being held in the Shadow Realm. He believes he's going to need an army to rescue the children, so he suggests that they go to Omnipotent City. While there, he can petition the aid of the other gods for support. Jane deduces that Stormbreaker is going to require a conduit to help it focus so they can use Valkyrie's ship. Jane puts Mjolnir down for a moment, and her cancer is shown to be taking a toll on her. She has a flashback of her mother, who also died of cancer. Now, I absolutely love this scene when Gorr enters New Asgard because he looked like a true villain. The shadow creatures, creepy glowy eyes, and all of that was done perfectly. By the way, I don't know if you noticed, but there's a fun little Easter egg here if you really pay attention to the whiteboard that Meek was writing on. The funny thing is that Taika Waititi clearly trolled all of us because he spoiled the entire movie by showing the storyboard art in that scene. You can see Thor going before Zeus and even the Bifrost being needed to reach eternity and so on. Now, while I did enjoy the depiction of Gorr when he was abducting the children, I was not a fan of Bale's performance when he was meeting with the children. I'm referring to when he chopped off the head of that creature to scare the kids and he was doing that creepy laugh or whatever. I just didn't care for it because it felt like Bale started to make Gorr more like Pennywise, you know, that clown from It. I thought Gorr was already terrifying as he was and didn't need to toy around with the kids. I thought the hammer jealousy was really funny here, but it also establishes the fact that the hammers are sentient. One thing to remember is that Stormbreaker was originally made out of Groot's arm, and Groot is pretty much a basic living tree. So mix that with Asgardian magic or whatever, and you have a sentient weapon. Also, Mjolnir isn't going to just go to Thor because of the spell that he cast on it earlier to protect Jane. We've seen Thor actually lift Mjolnir on the ship, so it's not an issue of worthiness, but rather Thor's spell to protect Jane is just working. Speaking of which, Jane is clearly struggling with her cancer despite having the power of Thor. Now, we'll talk more about why she's really struggling, because I don't think this film did a good job of explaining why she's still dying of cancer despite being the Mighty Thor. One piece of information to remember here is what Valkyrie says to Jane. She told her that she's a Viking now ever since she became the Mighty Thor. That actually carries a lot of significance later in the movie, but we'll cross that bridge later. Now, earlier in this scene, Thor spoke of the Necro Sword being passed down since the dawn of time. Now, what this is alluding to is an ancient evil being named Null. If you're unfamiliar, Null is basically the king or the god of the symbiotes. Remember Venom and Carnage? Those are symbiotes, living parasitic creatures that live off of their hosts. Null is the god of all of them, and the Necro Sword was his creation. In the comics, Null existed before the universe was created. Before Celestials started making the universe, Null was there, and he eventually created the Necro Sword and started killing some of the Celestials and absorbing their power. One way or another, he was banished and sealed away, and that's why he created the symbiotes to kind of act as an extension of himself. Remember in Venom 2, Venom talked about how they were all a hive mind. Well, think of Null as the ultimate mind for that hive. Anyway, the MCU could change some or all of that, so for the time being, just know that Null is the real big bad working in the shadows. Those whispers that Gorr heard from the very beginning of the movie, yeah, that was more than likely Null whispering to him after some symbiote goo got into Gorr and infected him, when he cut his hand. But we'll continue this point later on. Let's get back to the story. The team reaches Omnipotent City and hides among the crowd. Thor is placed on center stage as he pleads with Zeus for help to raise an army. Zeus declines his request and says that every god is only responsible for their own people. He admits to Thor that he is indeed afraid of the Necro Sword and that the threat of Gorr is minimal. Zeus is confident that Gorr won't find them in that city, and nor will Gorr be able to reach eternity because he doesn't have a key. Valkyrie explains that whatever being is able to reach eternity, they will be granted their wish. With Zeus's decline, Thor and his friends begin to fight off the guards. Zeus strikes down Korg, and he almost does the same against Thor until Thor takes the Thunderbolt and hurls it back through Zeus's chest. The team takes Zeus's weapon and escapes the city. Alright, so real quick, let's just kind of take a look at a few quick Easter eggs here with all these gods. I thought that the golden dragon was really interesting. I know some people think that it was like the Mayan or Aztec god, but I really wonder if it might have been the god of dragons that has a connection to Shang-Chi. We did see a lot of dragons there. Maybe they have their own god. I do also think that there was a nice subtle tease with the two gods sitting right in front of Thor and his team. Bast, the Panther god, just so happens to be sitting next to who I think is the Aztec god, who is the Jaguar god. Now, why is that significant? Well, for one, it seems like a pretty obvious tease for Black Panther 2, Wakanda Forever, where supposedly Namor will be facing off against Wakanda. We know that the Wakandans worship Bast, the Panther goddess, and whoever has the mantle of Black Panther gains super abilities after taking the heart-shaped herb. It's possible that Namor could possess the powers of his Aztec Jaguar god in a similar way. This may also disrupt the idea of Namor being a mutant, but then again, we don't know how Marvel's going to define mutants in the MCU yet. As for this scene with Zeus, I was not a fan of Russell Crowe's rendition of the character. I thought it was unnecessarily silly with all his antics. However, I will say that we did get another quick taste of Thor stepping up in his godhood. Remember, I mentioned how Thor was doing things similar to Odin. Well, when he caught that thunderbolt and threw it back, I think that was just a bit more evidence of Thor rising up the ranks. Think about the mythology parallels when it comes to Norse and Greek god mythology. Zeus was to Odin as Hercules was to Thor. But now that Thor seemingly could take down Zeus, I think that's just the MCU's way of showing us that with no more Odin around, Thor is getting closer to his real destiny, which comic fans may know as Rune King Thor. That's basically an all-powerful version of Thor that can tap into the Odin force. Alright, let's get back to the story. Thor revisits the Asgardian kids and reassures them that he's on his way to help them. He makes amends with Stormbreaker and shares a drink with it. Thor professes his love for Jane and tells her that he wants to feel really crappy about her. She, however, reveals that she has cancer. He assures her that he'll be by her side throughout their entire journey. As they land in the Shadow Realm, they notice that the children were not there. Jane discovers Gorr's true intentions were to steal Stormbreaker to open the Bifrost in order to reach eternity. She threw Stormbreaker into space, however Gorr trapped them all to force Thor into recalling the weapon. Trying to save Valkyrie and Jane's lives, Thor does recall Stormbreaker, and off they go to fight against Gorr and the Shadow Monsters. Valkyrie gets severely injured while fighting Gorr, and the team is forced to retreat. As Thor summons the Bifrost to leave, Gorr steals Stormbreaker away from him. Jane's cancer is getting worse, and she's left in a weakened state. At the hospital, the doctor informs Thor that something is preventing the chemo treatments from fighting off the cancer. Mjolnir is draining her mortal strength and that it is preventing her from getting better. Jane wants to go fight Gorr, but Thor asks her to stay because he's afraid of losing her again. Now, when Gorr had everyone captured, I've got to give Taika Waititi some credit for some good writing here. Gorr talked about how Thor asked the gods for help and they ignored him. He appealed to Valkyrie's emotions with her fallen sisters in battle and how the gods didn't help them either. Then he mentioned how both he and Jane are in similar situations where they both have weapons that give them power, but at the same time, they're both dying from those same weapons. I like the fact that Gorr was able to appeal and connect with everyone. Altogether, this was a good way to show how Gorr was right about the gods, but obviously there's a key difference. And that difference is that our heroes didn't just turn evil despite whatever true things were said about the gods. And in my opinion, the only reason that this movie establishes for Gorr's flip is the fact that he was tainted by the Necro Sword. If it wasn't for that, maybe he wouldn't have turned all evil. Anyway, we're starting to see the overall theme of love and loss play up a little bit more. Keep in mind, this is the continuous theme. Thor confesses his love for Jane, but at the same time, they both realize that they feared losing one another. You see more of that fear from Thor once he learned that the hammer wasn't making Jane any better. Hence why he didn't want her to join him in that final fight against Gorr. Now this does get a little bit deeper and closer to the end of the film, but I want you to just keep this in mind because all of this ties into Thor's journey. Now when it comes to Mjolnir and Jane, I thought that there might be a minor plot hole and that I thought that they could explain it just a little bit better. Recall that Thor placed the enchantment on Mjolnir to protect Jane, but it seems odd that it's also killing her at the same time. One would think, especially if Mjolnir is sentient in whatever way, that the hammer would just stop coming to Jane since it's literally killing her. So even though the MCU is inspired from the comics, I do think that this would be a good time to rely on the explanation given by the comics as to why exactly the hammer was killing Jane. In the comic books, and it was supposed to give the wielder great health, right? Well, according to the comics, the magical hammer does actually purge any bad or, let's say, foreign toxins from Jane's body. However, the chemotherapy drugs are not natural to her body. So Mjolnir is probably purging the drugs out of her system and leaving the cancer cells, because the cancer cells are a natural part of her body, even though it's killing her. I hope that explanation helped for anyone that was a little confused by that. Anyway, let's get back to the story. Thor takes the Thunderbolt from Valkyrie and heads to the center of the universe. Meanwhile, Gorr is using Stormbreaker to open the door to eternity. Thor comes in to rescue the Asgardian children. He imbues them with his powers, temporarily, and they all begin to fight the shadow monsters. During the fight, Jane senses that they are in danger, and she dashes in to save Thor. They tag team against Thor and destroy the Necro Sword. Gorr begins to revert back to his original form. While Jane is holding on to dear life, Gorr has made it to eternity. Thor pleads with him to choose love over revenge. Thor decides to spend his final moments with Jane. Gorr is afraid that if he wished for his daughter's return, that she would be alone, but Jane reassures him that she will not. Gorr's wish to eternity brings his daughter back to life. Thor and Jane share in a final embrace as she dies and fades away. Gorr asks Thor to protect his daughter before he dies. Jane is memorialized in New Asgard, and the Asgardian children are safely back at home. Thor is shown to be taking care of Gorr's daughter, and they head out together into battle as she wields Stormbreaker and he wields Mjolnir. They are both known as Love and Thunder. So in case you didn't know, the actress that's playing Love, or Gorr's daughter, is actually Chris Hemsworth's real-life daughter. So I thought that was actually kind of cute. But anyway, once again, we get another display of Thor stepping up and pulling a move just like his daddy Odin by giving his powers to all the Asgardian children. And I think it's also interesting to see how Thor's powers connect to those who share in his power. That's why Jane was woken up so suddenly in the hospital bed and knew that something was wrong. Now, when it came to Gorr, notice the moment the Necro Sword was destroyed, he started to gain more control over himself. He was able to be reasoned with by Thor and had a change of heart pretty quickly. It almost makes you wonder, had he not been possessed by the Necro Sword in the beginning of the film, would he have ever renounced his religion? That's why I thought it would have been more effective to have less of the corruption, possession narrative, because it delivers a better payoff when a character can have a shift in their heart or mindset more organically. Now, as I mentioned before, the Necro Sword corruption takes away all agency from Gorr. At the same time, it also lessens the impact of any of his decisions. He didn't really want to kill all gods. It was never his plan to begin with. Then you also have the fact that he didn't even kill any gods that were significant. Zeus even admitted to that earlier in the film. Lastly, he didn't even do anything to really push Thor's character. If anything, Thor helped Gorr. And I say all this because I just can't put Gorr at the top of my MCU villain list. Sure, Christian Bale may have acted very well in most of his scenes, but the character overall was nothing more than just a random pawn under the control of an even bigger bad lurking in the shadows. In my opinion, that's the new MCU villain problem. Moving on, if we were to put on our theory hats for a moment, even the wish to eliminate all gods was probably Null's wish. Maybe it's the gods that trapped Null away. And I don't know, maybe if the gods are all killed off, Null can be free to roam about unchecked. But once again, we're going to have to wait and see if that's the route the MCU wants to set up. Now, I have to say, Natalie Portman was one of the best parts of this entire movie. She felt like she was the most balanced out of all the characters. One thing to notice with her death was that she turned to gold dust after she died. This harkens back to what Valkyrie said about Jane now becoming a Viking. The moment she became Mighty Thor, she pretty much became a god. As the MCU has made clear in the Disney Plus series Moon Knight, people will go to whatever afterlife they believe in. With Jane dying as a god, that means that she's going to go to Valhalla, just like all the other Asgardians who died in battle. However, there's a catch to this, and I'll address that later when we talk about the post-credit scene. Now, I have to say that I like the final act of this movie mainly because it captured the real heart that the theme of love was striving for. The moment Jane and Thor had at the end, I thought was a great way to bring that theme of love and loss full circle. We saw that their relationship was broken because they feared being in love. Then, when they came back to each other, they didn't want to lose one another again. But at the very end, they both chose love and conquered their fears in the face of death. Why? Because love must conquer all, including the fear of losing that love as well. Thor finally accepted that truth in the end, and I thought that was pretty beautiful given the circumstances they were facing with Gorr. Now, I do want to go back to that last piece where we saw Thor making pancakes for Gorr's daughter, Love. Seeing as though she was birthed from eternity, it appears she has cosmic powers and is a god, which I guess is a bit ironic given her dad's track record. No way of telling where they go with her storyline in the future, but I do have to wonder one thing, and that's the direction this means for Thor. Given all the loss and trauma he's endured, I can't help but to think, when is he going to become more serious? Is he destined to just be the man-child god of thunder for another 1500 years? Or will having this young girl in his life force him to mature a little bit more? We see Zeus reminiscing about the old days, when people used to fear and worship the gods. He laments the fact that gods have become a joke and instead, people only care about superheroes. He proclaims that humanity will fear the gods again when Thor falls from the sky. He asks Hercules if he understands, and Hercules says that he does. Well, let me just say that this is the version of Zeus I was hoping we could have gotten for the entire movie. He was like, oh, they done forgot about us? Oh, no more of that. Zeus went back to being a whole G. Now, this was teased earlier in the movie when Thor said that all the gods were going to seek revenge for what he did to Zeus. So it looks like Hercules is going to be the main enforcer. Now, I'm sure many Ted Lasso fans are super excited to see Brett Goldstein as Hercules. I think this was a pretty cool matchup for Thor, just like it was in the comics. They battled it out before, and it was a great match that pushed Thor to the very brink. Now, I won't spoil the outcome of that fight, but I have the feeling that Hercules isn't about to be some major villain that they're trying to make him out to be. First of all, Marvel doesn't have the guts to make Hercules a real villain. Let's just put that out there. They're not going to make him the Hercules that you saw maybe in the God of War series. Odds are Hercules is going to fight Thor, and they might have some, I don't know, Zack Snyder Martha moment as they joke about their fathers, and then they become best buddies. I also wouldn't be surprised if Hercules becomes the next replacement for Thor when the Young Avengers or some other team shows up in the future. Anyway, that's pretty much all there is for that first post-credit scene, so let's jump into the second one. Jane is now transported to a new place after dying in Thor's arms. She's greeted by Heimdall, who thanks her for looking after his son. He welcomes her to stay in Valhalla, and Jane looks on in wonder. So as I mentioned before, Jane's death at the end of the film proved that she was a Viking, and she was going to go into the afterlife that Vikings believed in. Moon Knight already established the fact that people will go to whatever afterlife they believe in. Now notice in this post-credit scene, she was welcome to stay in Valhalla, but she never actually responded. Now there are two things to consider here. One, according to Marvel's version of Ragnarok, which is the apocalyptic events of Asgard, it's actually a mythical tale of destruction and creation. Yes, we saw the destruction of Asgard, but at the same time, Ragnarok is also about the rise of new creation. It's a cycle that repeats itself over and over again. We did see New Asgard rise up, did we not? Despite being a cycle, it does make way for new gods to make their way. So as we've seen, Heimdall has his son, who has the gift of his eyes, for example. But that also brings us to another thing to consider, and that is Jane. Jane appears to actually have a choice on whether or not she wants to enter Valhalla. She never answered Heimdall when she was welcomed in. Spoiler alert if you have not watched Moon Knight, but at the end, we do notice that Mark Spector makes a similar choice when he was in the afterlife. That means that maybe some form of resurrection or reincarnation is possible in the MCU. With Jane now being a god, maybe it'll be a lot easier for her to return, because, you know, magic. And Marvel may have been a little coy with their final message at the end of the movie too, where they said, Thor will return. Which Thor do you think they meant? Do you think they meant Thor Odin's son or the Mighty Thor? So I think they're setting up Jane's return for the future, or at the very least, they're leaving that door open. If you're new here and you like what you see, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell so you don't miss out the next time I drop a video. I've got more videos and reviews to do for you all, and until next time, I'll see you all later.